Imagine a time before the world was even formed, before Middle-earth, before the elves, before men, before anything but the music of the Ainur, an eternal symphony sung by divine beings under the guidance of Eru Ilúvatar, the supreme creator. It was a song of harmony, of perfect design, but then a discord arose. A single voice, powerful and proud, wove its own melody into the music, twisting it, corrupting it, reshaping it to serve his own will. This was Melkor, the greatest of the Ainur, the one who would later become known as Morgoth, the first and greatest Dark Lord. Unlike the others who followed Eru's design, Melkor sought to create something entirely of his own. He was not content with merely singing the song, he wanted to rewrite it. His mind burned with ambition, his heart with defiance. In his arrogance, he believed he could improve upon the work of the Creator himself, but Melkor was not alone. Among the Ainur there was one who listened closely, who observed the power Melkor wielded and saw something beyond mere rebellion. He saw order, strength, a new vision for the world, one that could be reshaped, controlled, perfected. This was Sauron. At the time, he was not yet the Dark Lord that would later bring Middle-earth to its knees. He was Mairon, a Maya of great skill and intellect, a craftsman, a creator, a forger of worlds. Yet where Melkor was raw power and destruction, Mairon was precision and cunning. While Melkor burned with the desire to dominate, Mairon sought to bring order. In the beginning, he had no intention of overthrowing Eru Ilúvatar or rebelling for the sake of rebellion. What he sought was perfection, a world without chaos, without unpredictability. And so when Melkor, the most powerful of the Ainur, descended into the world to shape it as he pleased, Mairon followed. This was not an immediate fall into darkness. At first, Mairon still worked as a servant of Aule the Smith, one of the Valar, a being of wisdom and craftsmanship. He learned the secrets of forging, of structure, of creation itself. But as time passed, something gnawed at him. He saw the imperfections in the world, the disorder, the endless struggles of the lesser beings, and then came Melkor, whispering of power, of a better way. Unlike the Valar, who governed but did not dictate, Melkor took control. He was not bound by the constraints of harmony or balance. He imposed his will upon the world, and for Sauron, Mairon no longer. This was a revelation. He had resisted for a time, reluctant to abandon the order he once believed in, but Melkor's vision was undeniable. The world needed guidance, strength, and if no one else would enforce it, then they would. The moment Sauron pledged himself to Melkor was the moment he set upon a path far darker than even he could have foreseen. No longer simply an observer, he became the Dark Lord's most trusted lieutenant, the one who could see his master's vision through with strategy and cunning. Where Melkor was raw destruction, Sauron was meticulous control. Where Melkor burned with chaos, Sauron thrived in order. Yet for all his strength, Morgoth, Melkor in his full darkness, was something even more terrifying. He was not merely a ruler, he was not merely a sorcerer or a king or a warlord. He was a force of nature, a god among mortals, and his power was something beyond comprehension. Unlike Sauron, who relied on deception and sorcery, Morgoth's power was absolute. His mere presence could alter the very fabric of reality. The mountains of Middle-earth rose and fell at his command. The skies darkened when he willed it. He was not just powerful, he was power itself. Yet there was a price. Unlike Sauron, who always worked from the shadows, always kept his strength hidden and secure, Morgoth poured himself into the world. He bled his essence into his creations, into the corruption he spread, into the armies he raised and the weapons he forged. Every act of destruction cost him something. Every victory made him weaker because he had to give away his power to make it happen. This was something Sauron would never do. He learned from his master's mistakes. He saw the flaw in Morgoth's approach. And so, where Morgoth threw his power into the world, losing pieces of himself with every battle, Sauron concentrated his power into a single object, the One Ring. Instead of spreading himself thin, he condensed his strength into something that could be hidden, protected and preserved. Morgoth's reach was vast, but in the end it left him vulnerable. Sauron's power was focused, singular, and as long as the ring endured, so did he. This is where their greatest difference lies. Morgoth was a god who sought to remake the world, but in doing so he diminished himself. Sauron was a ruler who sought to control the world, and in doing so he preserved himself. One was a storm raging across the land, tearing everything apart in his path. The other was a spider spinning his web, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Yet for all his cunning, for all his strategic brilliance, Sauron never matched the raw power of Morgoth in his prime. He never controlled dragons that could shake the skies, nor did he command Balrogs in the hundreds. He never broke the very foundation of the world as Morgoth once did, but he didn't need to. His strength was in patience, in planning, in ensuring that even if he was defeated, he would always find a way to rise again. So who was truly greater? The god who shaped the world with his own own hands, only to be cast into the void, never to return, or the lieutenant who outlived him, who nearly conquered the world not with brute force, but with cunning, deception, and the will to bend others to his cause. In the end, the difference between them is simple. Morgoth wanted to remake reality itself, Sauron wanted to rule it, and in some ways that made him far, far more dangerous. The First Age was a time of legends, a time when gods and monsters walked the earth, and when war was waged on a scale Middle-earth would never see again. At the heart of it all stood Morgoth, enthroned in his mighty fortress of Angband, ruling over a dominion of darkness that stretched across the northern lands. The world was young, the sun and moon newly risen, but already Middle-earth was in the grip of its first great war, the war against the true Dark Lord. Morgoth's reign was not like Sauron's future rule. He did not sit in a tower, whispering to servants and letting others do his work. He was a warlord, a god of destruction, leading his armies himself, shaping the battlefield with his will. His fortress, Angband, was not merely a citadel, it was a fortress of terror, a place of endless pits, fire and industry, where orcs were bred in numbers beyond counting, where Balrogs waited in the shadows, and where his deadliest creation, the dragons, first took flight. Unlike Sauron, who would later rule through fear and control, Morgoth ruled through absolute strength. He did not need spies or deception. His enemies feared him because they knew he could not be stopped. When he unleashed his armies, they came like a tide, overwhelming everything in their path. He did not merely defeat his enemies, he obliterated them. One by one, the great kingdoms of the elves fell before him. The proudest of them, the hidden city of Gondolin, stood for centuries as a beacon of hope. But even it could not withstand the fury of Morgoth. His spies, his vast armies, and finally the terrible might of Glaurung, the father of dragons, brought the city to ruin. Thousands were slain, the last remnants of resistance scattered. And yet, for all his strength, Morgoth's power came at a cost. He was not as he once was. Every act of creation, every act of destruction drained him. Unlike Sauron, whose strength was focused and controlled, Morgoth's power bled away into the world itself. He could no longer take on the form of an angelic being, as he had in the earliest days. He had become something diminished, hunched, darkened, filled with hatred and malice, but never again as great as he once was. Even so, he was still the mightiest force in the world, until the War of Wrath. It was not the elves nor the men of Middle-earth who finally ended Morgoth's reign. It was the Valar, the same divine beings he had once defied. For ages they had stayed out of Middle-earth's wars, unwilling to interfere directly, but at last they had seen enough. They sent the full might of their armies, led by Eönwë, the greatest warrior of the Valar, and what followed was the greatest war Middle-earth would ever see. Morgoth unleashed everything he had, his armies of orcs, balrogs and dragons, creatures of shadow and fire. The battle raged across Middle-earth for decades. Entire continents were shattered, mountains crumbled, the seas rose and swallowed whole lands. The very world was reshaped by the scale of the conflict, and yet Morgoth could not win. The Valar were too strong. His armies, for all their terrible might, were not infinite. His balrogs, his dragons, his countless legions of orcs, one by one they fell. His fortress of Angband was breached, his throne was shattered, and in the final moments, as the last of his servants were hunted down, Morgoth, the greatest of the Ainur, the first Dark Lord, was captured. There was no trial, no debate. The Valar cast him into the void, sealing him outside of time and space itself, where he would remain forever. But even as he fell, his influence remained. His shadow lingered deep in the hearts of men, in the ruins he had left behind, and most of all in the mind of his greatest servant, Sauron. For Sauron, the fall of Morgoth was more than just the end of an era, it was an opportunity. Unlike Morgoth, he had never wasted his power, never allowed himself to become so drained that he could no longer fight. Sauron had learned from his master's mistakes. He had watched as Morgoth ruled through fear and brute strength, and he saw how it ultimately led to his downfall. And so, as the First Age ended, as Morgoth was cast into the void, Sauron did something his master never could. He vanished. He did not fight the Valar. He did not make a final stand. Instead, he fled. For centuries he hid in the shadows, waiting, planning, learning. He knew that brute force alone was not enough. If he was going to rule, if he was going to succeed where Morgoth had failed, he had to do it differently. The Second Age was not an age of great wars or endless destruction. It was an age of manipulation. And this is where Sauron truly surpassed his master. For unlike Morgoth, Sauron knew how to deceive. He did not return as a Dark Lord clad in black armor, leading armies of monsters. He returned as Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, a beautiful, wise and kind being who offered the elves knowledge, power and the secrets of creation. He became a friend to the greatest elven smiths, most notably Celebrimbor, the grandson of Feanor himself. Together they forged the rings of power. Sauron was patient. He played the long game. The elves trusted him. They believed in him. And by the time they realized the truth, it was too late, for Sauron had already created the One Ring, the key to his dominion. Where Morgoth's strength had been wasted, Sauron's was focused. Where Morgoth had ruled through terror alone, Sauron ruled through control. His armies grew not just through breeding and conquest, but through corruption. The 9 kings of men did not fall in battle. They were seduced. The great kingdom of Numenor was not destroyed by war. It was manipulated into its own destruction. By the time the elves understood what had happened, Middle-earth was already falling into darkness. Sauron was not Morgoth. He was something worse. He did not just destroy, he enslaved. He did not just conquer, he controlled. And where Morgoth's power had faded into the world, lost forever, Sauron's power was eternal as long as the ring endured. This was the difference between them. Morgoth shattered the world, but in the end he was cast down. Sauron poisoned the world, and in doing so he nearly ruled it forever. For centuries Sauron worked in secret, perfecting the art of deception, an art his master Morgoth had never mastered. Morgoth's power had been raw, overwhelming, a force that could not be reasoned with or bargained against. He had burned his strength away in war after war, bleeding himself into Middle-earth until he was no longer the godlike being he once was. But Sauron had learned from his master's mistakes. He had no interest in wasting his power. He would not rule by sheer force alone. He would rule by guile. And so he returned, not as a conqueror, but as a gift-giver. The elves did not recognize him. To them he was Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, a being of beauty, wisdom and knowledge, offering them something that no other had ever given them, the secrets of creation, the ability to forge power into metal itself. He came not with swords, but with promises, not with war, but with gifts. And the elves, great, wise and mighty as they were, believed him. For years Sauron worked among them, forging alliances, sharing secrets, watching as their greatest smiths, under the leadership of Celebrimbor, crafted the greatest treasures of their age, the Rings of Power. It was brilliant, a plan so cunning that even the elves, despite all their wisdom, did not see it for what it was. But Sauron had not merely come to help the elves forge the rings. No, his plan was far grander, far more insidious. He had his own ring to forge. Deep within the fires of Mount Doom, he poured his malice, his hatred, his very essence into a single object, the One Ring. This was no mere artifact. It was him, a piece of his soul, a tether between him and the rings he had helped create. As long as it existed, he could not truly be defeated. As long as it remained in his grasp, he was immortal. With the One Ring complete, his deception was over. The moment he slipped it onto his finger, the elves felt it, a terrible force invading their minds, a will far greater than they had ever known. And they understood too late what had happened. Sauron had outmaneuvered them. The elves, realizing the trap, hid their rings before he could corrupt them. They were able to resist his control, but the damage had already been done. The 9 rings had been given to the kings of men, and though they believed themselves mighty, they were no match for Sauron's will. One by one the 9 fell, their souls stripped away, their bodies decayed until they became something worse than dead. The Nazgul were born. And in this moment Sauron became more than a mere warlord. He became something Morgoth had never managed to become, an unseen force, a master of shadows and whispers, a being whose influence stretched beyond armies and battles. And then, with the elves scattered, the rings corrupted, and his own power growing, Sauron turned his gaze toward men. At the time, the mightiest kingdom of men was Numenor, a land of towering cities, great ships and warriors that no force in Middle-earth could match. The Numenorians had once been the greatest allies of the elves, blessed with long life and wisdom by the Valar themselves. Sauron hated them. They were the last true power that could challenge him, the only kingdom that could stand against his dominion, and so rather than fight them, rather than challenge them on the battlefield where he might have been defeated, he let them win. When the Numenorians came for him, he did not resist. He surrendered. It was unthinkable. The Dark Lord of Middle-earth kneeling before the King of Numenor, offering himself as a prisoner, but this was no surrender. It was the greatest act of deception ever played. For once inside Numenor, Sauron did not remain a prisoner. He became something far worse. He became an advisor. At first, he whispered in the ears of the king, flattering him, feeding his ego, planting seeds of doubt. The elves, he said, were not their allies. The Valar, he claimed, were not their benefactors. Why should they accept death when they could have immortality? Why should they bow to the gods when they could become gods themselves? The king listened, the people listened, and soon Numenor was corrupted from within. The greatest kingdom of men, the mightiest civilization ever built, became a pawn of Sauron. And when the time was right, he gave them one final push. He convinced the king to build a great armada to sail to the Undying Lands to claim the power of the gods for himself. And with that, Numenor was doomed. For the first and only time the Valar themselves intervened. They shattered Numenor, sending it beneath the waves, drowning its people, sinking its once great cities beneath the sea. But Sauron, he survived. His body was destroyed, but his spirit endured, carried back to Middle-earth, where he would rise again, more terrible than ever before. He no longer wore a fair face. He no longer played the role of Anatar, the gift-giver. His deceptions were over. Now he was war itself. Now he would take Middle-earth by force. And so began the last alliance of elves and men, the final war of the Second Age, the greatest battle since the War of Wrath. The free peoples of Middle-earth had no choice but to stand together, for Sauron had raised his armies, his orcs, his Nazgul, his war machines. For years the war raged. The greatest warriors of men and elves stood side by side, led by Gil-galad, the last High King of the elves, and Elendil, the last great king of men. And at last they marched upon Mordor. The battle was beyond anything the world had seen. The forces of Sauron outnumbered them, but the alliance held their ground. And then, at the very end, when Sauron himself stepped onto the battlefield, wielding the full might of the One Ring, something happened that he did not expect. He was defeated, Elendil was slain, Gil-galad was burned. But in that moment of victory, Isildur, son of Elendil, picked up his father's broken sword and struck the ring from Sauron's hand. And with that the Dark Lord fell, but Sauron was not Morgoth. He was not truly destroyed. As long as the ring survived, so did he, and in that one moment when Isildur held the ring in his hands, he had the chance to end it all. But he did not. The ring whispered to him, seduced him just as it had so many others. He could not bring himself to destroy it, and so even as Sauron's body perished, his spirit endured. He would return. He would always return. And when he did, the world would once again tremble. Sauron had fallen, but he was not truly gone. Unlike Morgoth, whose power had been scattered, whose very essence had been drained into the world until he was cast into the void, Sauron had done something his master never had. He had bound his strength, his very existence, to a single object. The One Ring was more than just a tool of power. It was him, his will, his soul, his essence poured into a vessel so that he could never truly die. As long as the ring remained, Sauron could always return, and so he waited. For a time, Middle-earth believed itself free. The Great War was over, the armies of Mordor were broken, the Dark Tower lay in ruins, and the ring, it was lost, taken by Isildur, who could have destroyed it, should have destroyed it, but didn't. The whispers of the ring worked fast. It was no ordinary treasure. It was not meant to be held or possessed. It was meant to possess others. And Isildur, for all his strength, was still just a man. He could not let go of the ring, and because of it, he perished, ambushed and slain, the ring slipping from his grasp into the depths of a river where it would lie for centuries. But the ring was not forgotten. It had a will of its own. It wanted to be found, and eventually it was. The world changed, ages passed, but Sauron's shadow never truly disappeared. In the east, whispers of a dark power stirring began to spread. In the ruins of Mordor, old evils gathered, and then something happened that should never have been possible. The Nazgul returned. The ring wraiths, Sauron's most terrible servants, had been defeated in the last alliance, but they had not perished. Like their master, they were bound to the ring. And as Sauron's power slowly began to rise again, so too did they. This was the difference between Morgoth and Sauron. Morgoth had been a storm, a violent force that could not be stopped, but one that burned out in the end. His war was one of total destruction, a war that reshaped the world itself, but Sauron's war was not one of fire and ruin. It was a slow poison. He did not need to destroy everything in order to win. He needed only to wait. And while the free peoples of Middle-earth went about their lives, believing their great enemy to be gone forever, he worked in the shadows, unseen but never truly absent. For centuries his spirit drifted, weakened, yet still bound to the world. It was not until he returned to Dol Guldur, hidden deep in the forests of Mirkwood, that his influence began to spread again. This time, however, he did not call himself Sauron. He was simply the Necromancer, an unknown force that seemed to have no connection to the Dark Lord of the past. And this was yet another way he surpassed Morgoth. Morgoth had never worked in disguise, never hidden his intentions, but Sauron was patience itself. For centuries he waited, he rebuilt his strength step by step, and then when he was strong enough, when the world had grown complacent, he revealed himself once more. The Dark Tower rose again, the land of Mordor burned once more with fire and shadow, and the war began again. But this time Sauron was no longer just a warlord. He was no longer merely a conqueror. He was something far, far more terrifying. He was an emperor, a master of domination, a force that could not be bargained with or reasoned against. This was the war of the Third Age, the war that would come to define the end of an era. But even as his armies swelled, as he brought Easterlings, Southrons, and all manner of dark creatures under his rule, Sauron still had one weakness, one flaw that no amount of power or strategy could erase: the ring. For all his wisdom, for all his cunning, Sauron had placed everything on the ring. He had thought himself invincible, unbreakable, as long as it remained, and in many ways he was. No army in Middle-earth could match his, no power could overthrow him, no blade could strike him down. But what he had never expected, what he could never predict, was that the smallest of creatures, a mere hobbit, would be the one to undo him. And this is where his greatest difference from Morgoth becomes clear. Morgoth had been an unstoppable force, a titan, a god of war. He had fought battles that shattered the very world itself, but when he was defeated, when he was chained by the Valar, it had been by the hands of those who were his equals, divine beings who were made to fight him. But Sauron? Sauron was undone by the one thing he had never foreseen, his own arrogance. He had believed the ring could never be destroyed because he could never imagine anyone willingly letting go of such power. He had believed that Middle-earth would have to fight him in open war because he could never imagine a world where his enemies would try anything else. And in the end, it was not an army that brought him down. It was Frodo Baggins, it was Samwise Gamgee, it was Gollum, a wretched creature who had been twisted and broken by the very object Sauron had forged to secure his rule. And when the ring fell into the fires of Mount Doom, when Sauron felt his essence begin to unmake itself, he finally understood his mistake. He had been too careful, too calculating, too certain in his own invincibility. Morgoth had fallen because he had spent too much of himself, leaving him too weak to resist when the Valar finally came for him. But Sauron? Sauron fell because he had placed everything into one thing. He had bound himself to the ring, believing it would make him eternal, but in doing so he had also made himself vulnerable, and so the moment it was gone, so was he. His armies crumbled, his tower collapsed, his spirit, no longer bound to the world, was scattered to the void, never to take shape again. This was the final, greatest difference between the two Dark Lords. Morgoth had been a god who lost himself in the world, pouring his power into his creations until he was no longer the unstoppable being he once was. Sauron had been a ruler who held onto his power too tightly, placing it all into a single vessel, believing himself invulnerable, only to be undone by his own arrogance. Morgoth's evil had been chaotic, a force of destruction that burned too brightly and consumed itself. Sauron's evil had been methodical, a web of control so tightly woven that when a single thread was pulled, the ring, it all collapsed. But in the end, one thing is clear. Though both fell, though both were ultimately undone, the shadow of Morgoth never truly left Middle-earth, for Sauron was but a pupil, a successor, and as long as Morgoth's shadow lingers beyond the void, whispering through time, waiting for the moment when fate itself might break, who is to say that the first and greatest Dark Lord might not one day return?